Coming to you from the shores of gorgeous Lake Michigan, this is home to passionate book lovers. Hosting more than 270 acclaimed authors in 14 years, including best-selling novelists Geraldine Brooks, Ann Patchett, and Mitch Albom. We're live at Interlochen Public Radio in Northern Michigan. Welcome to the National Writers Series. Tonight, a conversation with Yale professor and best-selling author Timothy Snyder, featuring his new book, On Freedom. With guest host Doug Stanton, also a best-selling author and an NWS co-founder. The National Writers Series couldn't do this without our amazing audience, dedicated volunteers, and talented authors.
I love NWS!
We're also raising writers with Battle of the Books and free writing classes to 3rd through 12th grade students across the region.
Thank you, NWS!
Tonight's event is supported by the Robert and Nancy Giles Truth Matters Author Conversations. A special thanks to our media partners, Interlochen Public Radio and the Traverse City Record Eagle. We'd also like to thank our sustaining sponsors, the Green Brick Foundation, Northgard Technology, West Shore Bank, Traverse City Tourism, and Cherry Capital Airport. And now, NWS Marketing Director Noel Riley will introduce tonight's event.
Welcome to this very special conversation between authors Timothy Snyder and Doug Stanton. I'm pleased to announce that we have people tuning in from Switzerland, Portugal, Canada, Austria, Sweden, Norway, and all across the United States. Thank you for joining us. Please note that all of our author conversations are indeed live streamed. You can check out our fall author lineup at nationalwriterseries.org. And now I'm pleased to introduce you to our guest host and featured author. Guest host Doug Stanton is not only an NWS co-founder, he's also a #1 New York Times bestselling author. His books include The Odyssey of Echo Company, In Harm's Way, and Horse Soldiers. Now that book was made into a feature film, 12 Strong, starring Chris Hemsworth. Doug has appeared in several documentaries and has won multiple awards, including the Stephen Ambrose Award by Rutgers University. He was one of the first graduates of Interlochen Center for the Arts Creative Writing Program. This experience inspired him to start NWS's own writing program for area youth. Author Timothy Snyder, well, he also has a very impressive resume. He is the Richard C. Levin Professor of History and Global Affairs at Yale University. He's also a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. His books have been published in over 40 languages and include Bloodlands, Black Earth, On Tyranny, to name a few, and of course, the book that he will be discussing, On Freedom. His work has inspired poster campaigns and sculptures, a punk rock song, a rap song, a play, and an opera. He's appeared in over 50 films and documentaries, and he lives in New Haven, Connecticut. We'd like to offer a special thanks to Interlochen Public Radio for allowing us to use a studio for tonight's conversation, and a last-minute thanks to Golden Fowler Furniture for signing on as a fall sponsor last minute. And now, please welcome Doug Stanton and Timothy Snyder.
Hello, good evening. Hi, Timothy.
Hi, good to see you.
It's nice. It's such a pleasure to talk with you. Welcome to the National Writers Series.
Yeah.
I can't wait to get into your book, which I've been reading. I've been a longtime fan of the Bloodlands and On Tyranny, and so thank you for sharing the evening with us. I know you'd like to set the table. We'd love to do that.
Sure.
If you'd like to kind of set the table, what we might talk about tonight.
Well, this is a book about freedom, which is a word we use a lot, but which I think we generally misunderstand. I think we've stretched it out and inflated it and worn it ragged. And what I'm trying to do is start from the beginning and give it what I think is the correct meaning, which is a positive meaning. There are many good things in the world. All of us have different commitments to different good things. Freedom is the condition in which we can mix and match and combine and realize the things we think are important. Freedom positive. It's not us against the world. It's us with the world. Mm-hmm. And it's also positive in the sense that even though freedom is what makes us an individual, we have to work together to create the conditions for freedom. No baby born in America is going to be free without the help from other Americans. So that's the basic framing idea of this book.
You said earlier in my reading that we've distorted or the ideas of freedom, or how, when people talk about freedom, what do they usually think? If you stop someone on the street and said, "Hey, are you free?" And what's their feeling?
Yeah, I mean, let me start with how do we get it wrong? I think the way that we get it wrong is that we define freedom as being something negative. That is, it's us against the world. So, and that makes a certain kind of sense, right? So, for example, I just came back from Ukraine, and I was in some territories which were deoccupied from the Russians. And of course, to be free, the Ukrainians have to remove the thing which is bad. But that's not enough. There's still the rubble to remove, and the playgrounds to rebuild, and the schools to restart, and the bus lines that have to run, right? So being free can't just be a matter of getting rid of the bad thing, no matter how bad it is. You can pull the barbed wire away, but what matters is not the barbed wire itself. What matters is the person behind the barbed wire. And so the right way to think about freedom is not that it's freedom from, but that it's freedom it's freedom to become the kinds of people that we could be. And I think if you ask the person on the street about freedom, I mean, this is the thing that bothers me the most maybe about our American conversation, is freedom makes people mad. Usually when people talk about freedom, they're angry. And that's a sign that we've gotten things wrong, right? It's a sign that we've directed our energies against each other rather than directing them towards a project for the future of how America could be a country in which more of us could be free.
What are they mad about, do you think?
That's a great question. I mean, and it's one of the things I try to address in the book, because although this book starts with a definition of freedom, it works its way through practical connections between freedom and government. One of the middle chapters, so I have something which I call the 5 forms of freedom: sovereignty, unpredictability, mobility, factuality, and solidarity. And I think the mobility part speaks to your question. I think one of the things people are angry about is that although they're told it's a free country and they're told there's an American dream, it's actually pretty hard for a lot of folks to get somewhere. And that has to do with a lack of solidarity and a lack of institutions. But it's pretty easy to tell people that the reason for it is something else. It's the immigrants, it's the other people, it's some conspiracy that's gotten in our way. And so for that reason and others, if we want to be free, we have to think about the conditions of mobility. So as people mature into the world, they actually have places to go. And that means not only the roads, it means also the schools and the universities and everything which enables us to get up and go somewhere, to rebel.
So this book on freedom, which is the exciting thing about reading your work, Dr. Snyder, is that it is a bit like all these ideas are coming in, and you are able to syncretically, snap the mirror into a place. At the end, you've got some news, some history, some philosophy. I would say that this book should speak to us, the people on the street, even though it's operating at a very high level. It's written in a way that I think it's proscriptive, and I just wondered what you would like us to take. When this book lands in the American culture, when the global culture today, and what effect would you like it to have on us when we leave this evening?
I'm going to say something a little bit unusual and conservative here, Doug. I think it should matter to be right. I would like for this book to have an effect, but I would like for it to have an effect because the argument is correct, and not just because I'm speaking to people's emotions or telling people what they want to hear. And I mean, that goes to, I think, a mistake we make about freedom. I think we think we're free when we're following our impulses, or when we feel good, or when when our fur is being stroked the right way, or even when somebody's making us mad against the things we are used to being mad. Then we think we're free, but we're not. We're being manipulated, we're being pushed around, we're being classified. And so what I'm trying to say is that my hope is that this concept of freedom, which is so important to so many of us, can actually be correctly defined. And I think that it can be correctly defined. So it's a very conservative book in the sense that I believe in right and wrong. And I believe that there are right answers to questions and wrong answers to questions. And I believe that the negative way of thinking about freedom is actually wrong. It's illogical. It can't hold up, but also wrong in the sense that it leads us into the wrong places. If we think freedom is just about rebelling against government, then we make government so small that it's dysfunctional. And then we can't actually create the conditions we need for freedom. So my hope is that if I can get the definition of freedom right, then then things might go the other way if people are persuaded and take action on their own. Namely, that we can start thinking of the way that government or working together can create the conditions for freedom, and we can get a positive spiral going where the right kinds of action based on the right kinds of ideas make more and more people free. And we get ourselves into a virtuous cycle instead of the vicious cycles that I think we find ourselves in now. So you're right. The book does all kinds of things. It's part memoir, part philosophy, part history, part reporting, and I'm using all these different genres because I think the terrain has to be made fresh. You know, there's so much junk on the terrain. There's so much about freedom which doesn't really make any sense. It's so overfull. And so what I want to do is I want to get people's attention and find and give them something to read which is interesting, you know, which is about people, about recent history, where, you know, and by the way, it's not about how I'm always been right. You know, like if you look at the genre of memoirs and you look at books about freedom, those are two kinds of books where the author is generally always right, which is of course very suspicious, because I think if you're free, that means you're not a prisoner of anybody's story, including your own story, right? If you're going to be free, that means you have to be able to listen and recognize when you've made mistakes. So one of the methods that I use in this book, which I think is a little unusual, is to note when I've made mistakes and try to use those mistakes to show, you know, how an idea of freedom over time, as you recognize your mistakes and listen to other people, can become broader and more inviting, and I think more true.
This brings us maybe to the fourth form of freedom here, factuality, which we could talk about a lot tonight. You say things like we can't have government or we can't have society without an agreement upon a reality, correct? So just talk about that for a moment. I've heard you say that it's so hard even today to say, I believe in truth.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think we should, I'd like to say right now, I personally believe in truth, and I suspect you do too.
Thank you, Doug, because like I go on stage an awful lot and I say like we have to be able to say we believe in truth, and people could be kind of like maybe a little half-hearted nod, and they look around because they're maybe a little afraid, you know, that they're exposing themselves. Yeah, I believe in truth, at least as an ideal, at least as a horizon, at least as something we should be stretching ourselves towards. Absolutely. And it's and there's it's a value to be affirmed, but it's also a practice. I think, you know, going back to your question about what are some of the mistakes we make, I think one of the mistakes we make is that we think if we all say the things that spring to our lips to say, like, or if we all listen to all the things which the social media, you know, throws out at us, somehow in that whirl, you know, somehow in that cauldron, the truth will emerge. And that's not correct, right? We have to value truth, and then we have to think about what institutions are most likely to produce facts which are going to be useful for us. Because this ideal of truth has very, as you've already suggested, very elemental political consequences. It's normal for us to have different values. That's normal. That's good. But if we have different facts and different values, then we can't compromise. If we have different values in the same facts, we can compromise, we can get somewhere, and we see the point of talking to each other. But if we have different facts and different values, we can't compromise, and we don't see the point of talking to one another. And that means that it's very hard to compromise and make progress. But it also just means that democracy starts to seem senseless after a while.
Thank you. I mean, so this is a quite personal challenge for me, for maybe many of us. How do we talk to those people in our lives whose sense of truth over the last decade has changed? We now seem to be living in different realities. Each of them have their own firm footing, and you make a big deal in your book on freedom about how the internet has enabled that. And something about the calculus of the nervous system, the algorithms. We become acclimated to this pattern of reaction. So could you talk about where we're getting our reality and how we can repair that? how can we move beyond that?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, because unfortunately, social media, which comes on the scene around 2010, is based on a kind of attention economy. And in other words, eyeballs make money. And the way to keep eyeballs on screens is not to give people the truth or the facts or things that challenge them. It's to give people a certain pattern of reinforcement, 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 and then a bit of fear. And that pattern is known from behavioralism. It's known from psychological experiments done on animals and people from the middle of the 20th century onwards. And so essentially, social media is designed to speak to the worst of us. It's designed to speak to the parts of us which are anxious and fearful and conformist and looking to be led. And so almost regardless of what the content is, the form of social media is molding us into people who can be classified and who can be predicted. And what's worse, are made more predictable over time. Social media, it's a word I invent for the book, social media predictifies us. It makes us more predictable than we would be otherwise. And this is very bad, because if you can be predicted either by a machine or by a person, then you can certainly be ruled. Or to put it a different way, you're living inside somebody else's story and you don't know it. You're a character in a story which somebody else is writing and you don't know it, right? So you can yell as much as you want, but you're just yelling as a character in a story that somebody else is writing. Somebody else is picking up the pen, or they're writing on the keyboard, and and those are the things that you're yelling when you think you're free. So what do we do about all this? And I agree with you, it's incredibly hard. Number one, this is a really good argument for why there has to be a government, right? Not all governments are good, but if you want freedom, then you have to have a good government, a government which is designed to create the conditions of freedom. And one of the conditions of freedom is that we don't have huge media monopolies, which are able to spend so many hours inside our brains. We shouldn't have huge media monopolies which are able to suppress other forms of journalism by sucking up their markets and their advertising. We shouldn't have huge media monopolies which, without any sort of penalties, spread information which is false and harmful. So we have to have a government which regulates the big companies. That's the first thing. The second thing is that, and this starts from us, it's hard to make other people do this, but we have to spend less time online. Right? I mean, it's one thing to watch me and you. We're a little bit unpredictable, I hope. But it's another thing to be like most Americans and spend 7 or 8 hours of time in front of screens, much of which is highly regulated activity. We don't see the regulation, but the social media is there in the background. The algorithms are there in the background, making us more predictable. So it would be healthy if all of us spent more time offline than we do. And then the third thing is, it speaks to a subject we already raised. We have to create facts. So part of the problem is social media, but part of the problem is the absence of other sources of factuality. The rise of social media has been accompanied by the desertification of American journalism. Right, most of America is now a news desert. Geographically, most American counties no longer have reporters. And that means that people aren't used to the idea that somebody else might actually be looking for facts. And when you lose that habit, then you go national, you go polarized, you go international, you go conspiratorial. And so we have to think, okay, we need to have journalism that deserves some kind of that deserves funding, that deserves to be a life which can be lived in a decent way. That needs to be subsidized morally and financially. We have to say, okay, the journalists are actually the good guys. The journalists are the heroes. How do we make their lives possible? How do we create conditions in which they're not only free from threats, but in which that can be a vocation, in which that can be a profession? And as far as like talking to people, like I think it helps to start with personal things. And yeah, go ahead.
I just want to ask you a question. So then, what is the point of then making a journalist the threat to American society?
Mm-hmm.
What is the point of making the journalist the enemy of the people? In your rubric here of freedom and unfreedom, I just want to, for all of those watching and who are going to read the book, I just want to reiterate that the idea of positive freedom is very exciting. It's a freedom where you can engage, create, and you can reason. And the negative freedom is where you hate oversight, you hate regulation, and you hate government because you feel that all those things are holding you back.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, do I have that right? I mean, these are very interesting propositions. Yeah.
So, you got that exactly right. Yeah.
Why are we then in this and this, the algebra of these ideas, what does it serve to make the journalist the enemy in in
Okay.
the other game?
Okay, let me try to bring those 2 points together.
Okay.
So I believe negative freedom is American common sense, like to the point where I put the name negative freedom on it partly so that we can recognize ourselves. Because the things which are commonsensical, we don't recognize as being ideas. We don't recognize that they could change. We don't recognize that they're alternatives. So the notion that government is the problem, I think, is American common sense since Reagan, maybe before. And the idea that you need government to create conditions for freedom, I think, is quite alien, although it's true. So if the common sense is that freedom just means being against things, that means that you get out of the habit of thinking what you're for, which of course is the essence of freedom, right? The essence of freedom is, what am I for? What do I believe in? What would I take risks for? What do I think is beautiful? What do I think is true? What do I think is worthwhile? That's what freedom is really about. But if you're in the mental habit of negative freedom, then what you do is you see everything as a barrier, and you never have to take responsibility for yourself. And where does that lead? Well, it leads to a condition where, coaxed along by social media or bad leaders, you start to see other people as the barrier. They're in your way. They're the problem, right? And so instead of thinking about who you are, you think about them as the enemy. And journalists can be defined as a particular kind of enemy. Why? Because journalists produce facts. Journalists produce truths that are uncomfortable, because a truth is almost by definition somewhat uncomfortable for somebody, or it wouldn't be true, right? The only things which make everybody happy are lies. So journalists produce things that are uncomfortable for someone, right? They're uncomfortable, like reporting about water pollution is uncomfortable for a company. Reporting about the corruption of a city council person is uncomfortable for that city council person, right? It's always uncomfortable for somebody. And therefore, you can say, oh, well, don't listen to the journalists, because the journalists are just making you uncomfortable. They're the barrier. They're the problem. The facts are a barrier. Rebel against the facts. This is where negative freedom ultimately leads you. And this is where we are as a country, because we have an awful lot of fellow citizens and some very major politicians who are now saying the truth is a barrier. The truth is the problem. Just believe your emotions, just believe your impulses, just believe me personally, right? Because the truth is actually the problem. So negative freedom actually prepares the way. It prepares us for this smooth downward slide, to where we're annoyed when somebody tells us something true. We're annoyed when someone makes the world more interesting. We're annoyed when people produce facts, because we've been taught to think, well, all that stuff is just a barrier to who I really am, to how I should really feel.
Talk about free markets just for a moment. You've made some interesting points about the difference between being an object and a subject. That if we're going to have positive freedom, we need to take agency of our own selves as subjects. But if you think of the free market as somehow having its own agency, it goes in strange places. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's really essential. I mean, basically, the moment anybody says the word free market, I think they're in the middle of a crazy fairy tale. And it's a good example of how things which are just commonsensical and which we say without thinking in the US actually lead us down into a pretty dark place where freedom's not possible. To begin with, only people can be free, right? Like you and I and our audience, we all have our dreams, we have our possibilities, we have our commitments, we have our morals, we have our ways of combining these things, which are our own. That is what means that we can be free. A market cannot be free. An abstraction, a social arrangement cannot be free. And the moment that we cede the word freedom to the market, we're doing something very, very disempowering to ourselves. We're saying, okay, the market's free. And what follows from that is that we have a duty to the market. Suddenly, we have a duty not to intervene. We have a duty not to ask the market for healthcare. We have a duty not to regulate the market, and so on. And so we fall into this sort of trance because we've conceded the word, and then we concede the thing. So we're subjects in the sense, I mean, that's a funny way, I just got criticized by a friend of mine for using the word subject here, but we're subjects, as you say, we're agents. We're unpredictable real creatures with a special magical capacity in the universe to take what's moral and what's unpredictable and make it real. That's us. That's not the market. The market doesn't care. The market doesn't real. The market is created by us. The market has no feelings. The market doesn't care if it's regulated or not. The market doesn't care what the top tax rate is. The market's not alive. It's not a thing. We cherish the market as though it were some kind of, in a religious way, as though it had some kind of purity. And we should feel guilty if we do something to the market. But the market is it's a social arrangement created by us. It's exactly what we make it. And so the important thing is to begin from us and to say, okay, we were all born. We're all vulnerable as children. We all have to be raised. We want to be free. What are the conditions that will help us to be free?
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes the market is useful there, but sometimes other things which the market will not bring are essential. The market on its own is not going to bring you parental leave, but parental leave is a really, really good thing for the freedom of the child and of the parents. Market's not going to bring you 6 weeks of vacation a year, but the French can have 6 weeks of vacation a year, and that makes them freer than we are, and they work just as hard. So, and then the final problem, I think this is what you're headed for. I just had a lot to say on this topic. The final problem is that a lot of folks think that the market will make us free, right? They think that, okay, if we just have this market, somehow the buying and the selling, the supply and the demand, it's all going to somehow work out to bring us the good things like freedom and democracy. And that is simply not true. That is 100% false. The nature of freedom is such that you have to be rebelling against something. There's always some friction between you and the outside world. It's always what you think is good against the way things actually are.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as you name something like the market and say, oh, that outside thing's going to bring me freedom, you're conceding your freedom, because as soon as you do that, whatever the market brings you, you're going to call that freedom, which is what a lot of Americans do. And so I'm free. Oh, suddenly I'm free not to have health insurance. Suddenly I'm free to die younger. Suddenly all these things I have to call freedom, right? And so once we give away the word, we give away ourselves, and we find ourselves in this odd position where we feel we have duties to the market, and we get out of the habit of saying, okay, I'm the one who's going to define what it means to be free.
Two questions. A lot of us have friends who went to the University of Chicago. What would you say to Milton Friedman if he were to hear your thesis here? And the idea of economic determinism as being creating society or a polity. You seem to be positing something different. I mean, what do you say to people? Say, no, the market well, they say just the opposite of what you've just said to me.
Yeah. The funny thing about these characters, I mean, Milton Friedman's a little bit more radical, but really, when you go back and you read, for example, Friedrich Hayek, right, who is the source thinker for Milton Friedman. If you go back and read Friedrich Hayek and his book, it's actually much less radical than the things we think today, which is funny, right? Like he thought that it would be normal for everybody to have a minimum income. And he took for granted that the government was there to break up monopolies. And he said that monopolies are just as bad as Soviet state planning. And he said that, of course, it would be normal for us to act against poverty. And the interesting thing is that, like, all of these thinkers who are in the libertarian tradition, basically until you get to the 1980s, most of them are in favor, nevertheless, of at least breaking up monopolies, having some wealth transfer, avoiding terrible poverty, right? And part of the logic of that is that in order to be free, there can't be wild inequality, which almost all thinkers have recognized until the 1980s, and until we got to a condition of wild inequality where we are now, where a few people have as much wealth as the rest of the country. And in that situation, the conversation changes, and people talk more about the free market. They talk more about libertarianism, because that's what the people with lots of wealth have. And I didn't mention this before, but of course, one of the reasons why libertarianism is popular is because people who are very wealthy don't want to pay taxes, and so they want to be the power instead of government, and so they talk about small government. But to answer your question directly, there's no such thing as economic freedom. That concept makes no sense whatsoever. The only kind of freedom is human freedom. Freedom doesn't need adjectives, because it only applies to human beings. If you're going to think seriously about humans, you have to start from the moment the baby is born. And the moment the baby is born, the total absence of government is not going to be helpful. The total absence of cooperation is not going to be helpful. The idea that we're all individual loners who, on the basis of our own strength, are going to make it through the world, that is not helpful to a newborn baby. And we were all once newborn babies, and all Americans who to come are going to be newborn babies. That's where you got to start. And when you start there, you see libertarianism for the absolutely manipulative dream world that, in fact, it is.
So interesting. I have a question about the difference between politics and history, and whether or not we should be talking about, or when say I go forward from this evening talking with you, and I'm changed, I'm thinking new things, and I want to talk to a friend of mine. To use a real world example, I try to talk to him in historic terms.
Mm-hmm.
That the conditions we see now, if we look back into history, we can see have led to X, Y, and Z. It doesn't mean they will now, but we could be heading in that path. He or others really just want to keep talking about politics, which really just means current events.
Yeah.
And so that's my question. What is the difference between politics and history, and how do we address these issues?
I honestly think that goes back to factuality, because I don't want to speak too much about your friend, but just to kind of take it as a general example, I would push what you said one step further. Because when you say politics is really current events, I think often it's not even really current events. It's often stuff which didn't happen, or it's things that people said which are just sort of hypothetical, right? Like the number one news story right now as we're talking is about a lady in Springfield, Ohio, who lost her cat for a moment and then it came back. And then that event is somehow capable of generating, something that hundreds of millions of people then have to talk about. That's not an event, right? That's the way that we're all played by a warped media environment and ruthless tellers of lies. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that the first there are things that you and your friend, or me and you and your friend, we can't solve them individually, because they're going to depend upon a media environment which is basically different, where there's a lot more local reporting, where we have a lot more facts in common. And the thing about facts is that they have roots, right? They go back into history. And the way our media environment works now is that we wake up every morning, it's like nothing ever happened before. I mean, as a historian, I feel this with actual physical pain. It's like you wake up in the morning and the whiteboard has been scrubbed and we're all just starting all over again. And everything which I tried to teach people yesterday has been forgotten, right? And I think journalists have the same feeling, they want to move on in their storytelling or in their reporting, but they really can't. They have to keep saying the same thing over and over again, because they have to assume that everything started fresh this morning. So we have to get out of that. And so I sincerely believe, that history is liberating as politics, because history means that you're not being pushed around by the latest thing which has come across your screen that has made you feel a certain way. And it's liberating in a second fashion too, which is that if you're just on current events, or you're just kind of following, impulses, then it all seems like a mess, right? It seems like it's you and me, and we have different opinions, and why don't we fight about them right now? Let's sit at the bar and disagree about them. But if you think historically, you think, okay, people in the past actually got things done. There were policies that worked. There's a trajectory of things that have worked. We can ride some of those waves. We can pick some of those trajectories and keep going with them, rather than being in this kind of eternal present where all that matters is impulses, momentary opinions, emotions, disagreement. So I think one of the reasons why I focus so much on history in the book is that I think history empowers us in that sense. We realize, okay, things are going on. And the more you know about what's going on coming from the past, the better a chance you have to move, tilt, get things going into the future, and get away from this thing where we're all just kind of stuck on what you're calling current events.
Could you talk for a moment in that regard about what the difference between free speech and divisive speech? One of the large debates we have in the public sphere is, for instance, let's take the Twitter files. So on when it came to the COVID vaccine, the idea that the government was censoring speech by asking the government not to broadcast this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
How do you parse that line between free speech and whatever its opposite might be, divisive speech?
So I have a slightly different take, and I have to use somewhat different terms.
Okay.
So I'm going to stick to my doctrinal line that only people can be free. And that whenever we take the word free and put it in front of something else, we're taking the first step towards a misunderstanding, which is going to end up oppressing us. And I believe that to be the case, although lots of my friends disagree with me. I believe that to be the case with the phrase free speech. I don't believe that there is such a thing as free speech. I believe in freedom of speech, but I don't think that speech is free. I think the speaker is free. And I think this is really, really important because the most of the utterances that we deal with are generated artificially, algorithmically by computer programs. Most of the things which we happen to come across now don't have a human being behind them, right? And that changes the question, I think, considerably. If I'm a billionaire and I can purchase space on social media to broadcast a billion lies about my enemies, and these are perfectly true. That's a perfectly accurate rendition of things that happen now. I don't think freedom of speech is involved there because the billions of lies don't go directly back to me. If I'm a billionaire and I come to you and I say, hey, Doug, I believe that, your house should be painted a different color. Okay, that's something else. But if that person uses lots of money and then by way of anonymous intermediaries broadcasts a bunch of lies about you on some platform, I don't happen to think that there's freedom of speech there because there's no person there. There's no person. And you have to take a step back from there and say, okay, let's think it's freedom of speech and it's about speakers. Why is it about speakers? It's about speakers for one simple reason, and this is a tradition which goes back 2,500 years. It's about speakers because speaking truth to power is risky, right? And so when we protect the freedom of speech and protect speakers, we're doing that because we need the truth, and it's risky to speak the truth. And so that is very important to keep in mind before we get into the kinds of questions that you're asking. Because of course, when we protect freedom of speech, we're going to be protecting a lot of things that aren't the weak speaking truth to power. But the point of the freedom of speech is speaking truth to power. And when you start there, then you realize what's at the center of the problem. The center of the problem is not, the rich people with all the spectacle trying to divide us. What they're calling freedom of speech is not really very important, right? I mean, Elon Musk talks about freedom of speech all the time, but his freedom of speech is the least threatened literally in the universe, right? No one's freedom of speech is threatened less than his. He
What do you mean
owns
by
a media
that?
platform.
What do you mean by that? Yeah.
I mean that he owns a media platform,
Yeah.
which is essentially unregulated in this country. He can say whatever lies he wants. His company's profit model is to tell lies about important things like climate change, and that's not threatened in any way. Whereas the undocumented, whereas the Haitian in Springfield, or the undocumented person in California, right, or the African American who's not sure that he can vote or not, or whatever it is, those are the people whose voices actually are supposed to be protected by freedom of speech. We've got this all turned around, right? So on campuses, freedom of speech controversies generally involve distant oligarchs funding campus organizations so that somebody comes in from somewhere else, says something incredibly controversial, which that person knows is not true. Then we all get upset about free speech, yada, yada. And we miss the point that freedom of speech is not supposed to be about the distant oligarchs, the paid agents of chaos, and so on. So freedom of speech is supposed to be about the weakest of us who need to tell truth in an environment where there's always going to be inequality. So I haven't quite got to your answer, but I hope that your question, the way you put it, but I hope that gives you my answer.
No, you do. But practically, I have a question. If you look at a YouTube speech by Richard Spencer, the white nationalist supremacist, and he's saying these things which we find abhorrent, he has the right to do that, correct? In your world, so what is the prophylactic against that in society? I mean, do you want to control it? Do you want to just let it be, or so on? Yeah.
Well, no, I'm in this way, I'm very traditional. Of course, he has the right to say it, but one thing we have to do is not allow the people who are knowingly telling lies and knowingly spreading horrible views to claim the dignity of freedom of speech, which is what has happened. It's the people who tell horrible lies who then say free speech, free speech, free speech, free speech. and we're all supposed to think they're incredibly courageous. Even though in fact in the background is usually that distant oligarch, and there's the nice car with the tinted windows is going to drive them on to the next campus or the next YouTube recording or whatever it might be, right? We have let the people who lie in the name of the powerful, usually, or for the powerful, we have let them claim the dignity of freedom of speech. We've confused the idea of controversy with the idea of freedom of speech. Whereas freedom of speech actually needs to be associated with people whose names we've never heard, who literally need the protection because they are facing forces which are greater than them. That's where the action of freedom of speech actually is. So one thing is that we have to put the dignity of freedom of speech back where it belongs. And another thing is that we have to recognize, so freedom of speech is about, it's fundamentally about inequalities of power, and freedom of speech is fundamentally also about truth. So the fact that people have freedom of speech doesn't give them a license to lie. And it doesn't mean you can't criticize people for being wrong or incorrect or, just in horrifying bad taste or continuators of traditions of fascism, whatever it might be. The fact that they have freedom of speech doesn't mean that what they say is true or okay. It doesn't mean that we all have to be relativists. I think that's part of how this game works in the US. As soon as somebody says free speech, then the rest of us, like our buttons have been pushed, and suddenly we have to become moral relativists and not believe in facts. No, the fact that somebody has a right to say something doesn't mean that they're not wrong in every possible way. And their next move is to say, oh, now you're canceling me, right? But the fact that they're wrong is objective, right? And the fact that their views are horrifying is something which people can agree about, and it's worth saying. So no, there are lots of things one can do without limiting people's freedom of speech. But I think in order to empower ourselves to do those things, we have to take a step back and think about what freedom of speech is actually about, because the slogan free speech has been taken away by a certain class of people.
I have to ask you about, as we come down to we'll take some questions here in just a moment that have come into us, but you've come back from Ukraine and you have some interesting reflections, both on Freedom, the book, and just in your personal meetings with the president about freedom. But before I get to that, I want to ask something more basic, like who should I be reading in the Ukrainian fiction space? What Ukrainian poets can I read them? Have they been translated? You write that there is a great art scene in that country, notwithstanding. So,
Okay, I love plugging other writers. I appreciate that question. There's a fellow called Serhii Zhadan, which in English is Zhadan, who is both a poet and a novelist. He's also a punk rock or ska performer and does many other things. I happened to see him 3 times last week. Jadon stuff, a lot of it's been translated. A lot of the novels, some of the poetry. There's a great guy who I also happened to see last week called Stanislav Aseyev, Aseyev, who wrote a book called The Torture Camp on Paradise Street, which is one of the great bits of nonfiction about the recent war. He was captured by the Russians and held in what was probably the worst Russian concentration camp on occupied Ukrainian territory, and then survived and wrote a book about it. I would generally recommend, though, going to the website of the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. They have a press, and they have been producing beautiful translation after beautiful translation of contemporary Ukrainian writers. They're not the only ones, but they've done quite a lot, and especially in the last year and a half. So, general recommendation for that press.
I'm curious. You said something about when you met the president. Why? Well, you made a couple fascinating observations. Like most Americans thought that Ukraine would fold immediately, and we assumed as Americans that they would run. And you asked Zelensky why he wouldn't. He said why he didn't. He said something interesting. What was that?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that goes really deep to what freedom is. And I think it goes deep to the point of pain about why negative freedom is wrong. Because if you believe in negative freedom, right? If you believe that freedom is just you against the barriers, then you're kind of imagining that freedom is just out there, right? That it's the only problem is the barriers. If it's not the barriers, we'd be fine. And so then you imagine, we talked about this, but like you imagine then that the market, or maybe in your head it's the founding fathers, but something out there in the world is bringing you freedom, so long as there aren't barriers. And that way of thinking can get you into a bit of a fix, because what do you do at those moments when it turns out that the outside world isn't working for your freedom, when that becomes 100% clear? And I'm afraid the answer then is that you give up. And I'm afraid that's why we thought in February 2022 that the Ukrainians would give up, because we just couldn't imagine that when the outside world turns against you in such a decisive way, that you would fight for your freedom. We talk about fighting for freedom a lot, and then there was an example of when people did, and we were frankly stunned by it. I think to a large extent, we still haven't taken it in. And I think, there are some Americans who are resentful of Ukrainians for fighting for their freedom, because they think because they know they wouldn't do the same thing. But then going to the positive side, how Zelensky explains it, which is really interesting. If, like, again, this is positive freedom. So if you believe in things, if you believe certain things are good and true, and you live a life in which you're affirming those things by choosing among them, as you move forward in time, you create what we would call a character. And in this sense, free will plus time is character. You make those choices, and those choices live in you, and they live in the world around you that you've helped to create. And when you do that, you may sometimes reach a moment where there's only one thing you feel like you can do. So if you believe, if you're a negative freedom person, you can always try to run. But if you're a free person, sometimes you can't. Sometimes there's only one thing that you can do, precisely because you're a free person. There's only one thing that you can do.
You know what I thought of when I read that and when you said that is I thought of Gary Cooper in High Noon when he had to walk out into the street. It's an archetypal kind of moral character that circumstance create in you. Do I have that wrong? No.
No, that's right. I mean, but it's circumstance. I mean, I think it's circumstance plus time plus how you reacted to those circumstances, right? So, like when Zelensky talked about that dramatic moment, he hadn't had a whole bunch of other dramatic moments before that, but he had his mother and he had his father and he had some other choices, and so he got to that place, and it was the only thing he felt like he could do. Like it wasn't a choice. And there's something beautiful about that, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's something beautiful about thinking, because that goes to unpredictability. Like if we all just reacted to the greater force or the perception of the greater force, if we all just ran, we couldn't possibly be free. And by the way, this example doesn't have to be so dramatic. I mean, we have to take a little bit of risk, a little bit, small actions, take a little tiny bit of courage. But it's always true. Like, to be a free person means there's always gonna be a little bit of discomfort. And there's always gonna be a moment where you gotta do something other people aren't doing, or say something other people aren't saying.
What is it like to be in his presence, in the room with him?
I mean, he is the most, okay, so I've talked to a fair number of heads of state and government, and they're generally like charismatic and competent people. And I don't mean at all to put them down, but Zelensky has no need to try to impress you, which is unusual for heads of state. I would say it's unusual for for the male part of our species. It's unusual for people in general. He doesn't feel like he has to try to impress you at all. And the first time I talked to him, that conversation you're referring to, there was a counteroffensive underway in Kharkiv region, and the Ukrainian army had taken back most of the region that day. And we didn't even talk about that, not once. Like, he didn't even feel like he had to talk about it that day. So being with him is like being with an incredibly sensitive, intelligent human being on whose shoulders there is a tremendous amount of weight. And you can feel that he feels that. I guess that's the second thing. Like, he's clearly a good and decent person who thinks a lot about the terrible choices that someone in his position has to make. And because there are never perfect choices, right? He has to also bear the pain of what happens when you make a good choice, but it's an imperfect choice in a time of war. So I mean, but I like being with him, and I feel like he's a real lively, authentic presence. And when I wrote the book, which I was just able to hand to him, which I was very happy about a week ago, when I came into his office that first time and we were talking, I told him some stuff I thought he should know, and he already knew all that stuff. And he looked at me and he said, "Okay, well, but what do you want to talk about? What do you want to talk about?" And that is very generous in the circumstances. And I said, "Well, I want to talk about talk about that." Right. And that was wonderful. And it was to that openness, because a lot of important people wouldn't be willing to have an unscripted conversation about a difficult topic for 2 hours, you know, also during a war. But he did, right? And that's, I mean, that itself was a kind of unusual sign of how, I think, how much of a free person he is.
I'll direct our audience to your book Bloodlands to really understand the history of Ukraine, and also those of you watching, if you haven't seen Professor Snyder's, I think 18 segment course at Yale on the history of Ukraine, is quite fascinating. So it leads me to this question: why is Ukraine important to us today, both perhaps geopolitically and however else? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's important for the reason that you just kindly brought up, that it gives us examples of people who have to think about freedom. You know, I think I used the example of deoccupation earlier, and the Ukrainians are quite good about thinking about freedom, you know, in ways that was very helpful to me. Like, I took the manuscript to Ukraine 3 times, physically, the paper manuscript, and, you know, rewrote it, made notes, because I wanted to listen to people who were talking about freedom and taking risks for freedom. And they helped me a lot with the positive idea of freedom morally and intellectually. But in terms of why it's significant for a lot of reasons. I mean, if we just shifting from freedom to geopolitics and talking about freedom and geopolitics, this is a country which is actually trying to defend a democracy against an autocratic neighboring regime. If we let them go, if we let them lose, it's hard to imagine very many other cases where people will take that kind of risk to try to defend democracy. And that's bad news for democracy. Or to put it a different way, the Ukrainians right now are doing the work for us of making democracy seem like something that can defend itself. We don't have to do much to help them. And what we do to help them, we don't even notice. But if we do help them, they're doing the work for us of showing that democracy might defend itself because people actually believe in it and are willing to take risks. But then moving there from a more cold form of geopolitics. I mean, let's say you don't even care about freedom or care about democracy, and you have some very abstract notion of US interests or something. The Ukrainians are deterring China for us. The big concern up until 2022 was a war with China. And the Ukrainians are deterring that war by showing how offensive operations are difficult. But if we let them lose, then the Chinese may very well draw a different lesson from all this. The Ukrainians are also making nuclear war much less likely, because they're resisting a country with nuclear weapons that makes nuclear bluffs. If we allow the nuclear bluffing country to win and Ukraine to lose, then that will mean that many other countries will have to build nuclear weapons, either to carry out the bluff or to resist the bluff next time. And this is not hypothetical. This is thinking which is going on right now. And then, you know, maybe most importantly, the Ukrainians are defending a basic legal order in which borders are real and borders matter and states exist. And the Russians are denying all of that. All of our prosperity, all the predictability in our lives depends upon that basic idea that there are real countries, there are real borders, there are real states, and you can't just go into somebody else's country and take territory. The Russians are openly flouting that. They're saying it's nonsense. And the Ukrainians are defending it, not just for themselves, but as a kind of principle for how the world is supposed to work. So the Ukrainians are, you know, in the US, we have a tendency to take things for granted. I guess everybody does, but I think we take the Ukrainians for granted. They're doing it, or we treat them as a problem when in fact they're a solution. You know, they're doing a lot of work for us, not just for Americans, like in general. They're doing work to make the world better and to hold back things that could make the world much worse. And I think for that reason, even if we didn't care about freedom and democracy, which I believe very much we should, but even if we didn't care about those things, we had a very dry, cold notion of interest and security, there would be more than enough reason to try to help the Ukrainians to win.
It's interesting, though. I mean, I agree with you, but the argument here, alternatively, is that it doesn't matter. We should get out. It's expensive. Why are we fighting there? I mean, you hear this just on the street, you know, in the American airwaves, and a lot on the internet too. And I guess your answer is, well, that's wrong. You have your facts wrong.
Yeah, that's part of it. I mean, I'll also point out that the Russians are pushing that line really hard. And in general, Americans who say, and American politicians who say, we can't do anything in Ukraine, are also people who say, we can't do anything in domestic policy. Government's kind of useless. right? It all does kind of come back to negative freedom. Like this idea that government can't do anything good is literally a lethal idea, not just abroad, but at home. And the people who are doomers about Ukraine are also doomers about America. So it's kind of something to watch out for. But as far as the particulars, like, I mean, I'm happy to answer those arguments, although I don't honestly think anybody believes them. It's not expensive. We're spending a tiny fraction of our defense budget. The money that we spend is not money given to Ukraine. It's money which goes to American factories and gets production lines going. The money does not, for the most part, actually go directly to Ukraine. It's spent in the United States, and it creates American jobs. And what are the other parts? Like, oh, that we should get out. We're not there. They're doing all the work. They're doing all the damned work. They're the ones who are fighting and dying. They're the ones who are losing their limbs. We're not there. We're not fighting. They're fighting so we don't have to fight. They're fighting so that Americans are much less likely to have to fight a war in China or in Europe in the future. They're the ones doing the work. We're not there. We can't leave Ukraine because we're not there. All we're doing is helping them to do something. And in a very basic way, this is really important. The idea of cooperation. I mean, a few days ago, I was very close to the front line in northeastern Ukraine, and I was talking to infantry soldiers who fight and who have seen their friends die and have seen their friends wounded and who have been out there since the beginning of the war. And one of them said to me, you go back and tell the Americans we don't need their soldiers. And that's right. They don't need our soldiers. They need us to cooperate in a different way. They need some of our weapons. They need financial help. But all they want is cooperation. They want to do something together. They're doing their part, and they need us to do our part. And sometimes freedom is like that. Like, you can't do everything and I can't do everything, but together, sometimes we can do something. And that's how they see it. And I think that's how we should see it too.
I'm going to go to a question. We've had so many come in. I'm really impressed. We have someone from Switzerland, Norway, and Hawaii watching tonight. Dr. Snyder, in your extensive travels, specifically through Central and Eastern Europe over the past few decades, in your opinion, do Europeans view or value freedom like Americans do, or how do they? Yeah, go ahead.
That's a great question, because they don't talk. I mean, there are a lot of Europeans, right? And Europeans have different views and so on. But in general, and now somebody will perform some analytic on the internet and test me. But in general, I think it's fair to say that in languages besides American English, the word freedom turns up less. We certainly talk about it more. And I think some of the things that I believe we should talk about in terms of freedom are talked about in Europe in terms of social justice, which is not wrong. But I guess my view would be something like, a lot of the things that arose in Europe for other reasons are necessary for freedom reasons. So the argument for childcare can be made from a lot of sources, but I think the most powerful reason for it, and one that could speak to Americans, hopefully, would be that if there's better childcare, that there's a better chance for a child to grow up free. There's also more possibilities for parents to become free. So Americans talk more about it, but Europeans are actually generally more free and live longer lives. And that's something that Americans should be thinking about, because it's not the talking about it which leads to the freedom. It's maybe the thinking about it, or thinking about the institutions which can get you free, which will make you free.
Thinking about, by the way, being the name of your Substack newsletter, which is also incredibly interesting.
Thanks.
This is an interesting question. It goes to how we don't study history anymore, or we don't understand what military history is, or in general. But this faculty member at a school says, what would you say to high school students who reject, quote, traditions and have become jaded with, or aren't even aware of the importance of institutions? I'm not quite sure what they mean by this, but are they talking about history or the value of government? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I deal with a lot of former high school seniors. It's kind of my bread and butter. So I think there is a kind of, I'm just going to pick up that question where I think it lies. So I think there are people who are motivated to argue for a small government or a weak government or dysfunctional government because they are incredibly wealthy and want to be a government on their own. That's one reason to have that kind of view of government, that institutions only matter, that you have $50 billion, you live in California, you want to run the world. That's one. Another way you get to that view is you think, I'm kind of passive. I sort of want something else to make the decisions for me, therefore the market, right? And then you have younger people who probably think they're on the left, but who are actually drawn towards a similar position on the logic that something slightly different. Government's impure. It's impure morally. It involves making compromises, right? And therefore, it's not completely legitimate, and I'm a purer, better person if I just stay away from it. But compromises are actually, there are a lot of answers to that. Compromises are actually good things. Institutions are actually necessary. If you don't build institutions, other people will certainly build institutions that will involve you. But the sad irony here is that you do get some young people who think that they're on the left, who are in fact saying things that are very similar to what people on the hard right are saying about government. I think the net effect is a hard right effect, because the view that government should be kept weak, or we don't trust government, or we're not going to vote, ultimately helps the people who want to be the substitutes for government themselves. I answered a question. I don't know if I answered that question.
No, I think you did, and I think you also referenced the fact that you teach college freshmen, right? And you teach history.
Yeah.
And Dr. Snyder, Ukrainians who took back areas from Russian control said they were deoccupied, which is interesting, rather than liberated. You wrote that, quote, freedom is not just an absence of evil, but a presence of good. How do we maintain that presence of good in America, despite all that's going on around us?
So it's all about trying to create virtuous circles, right? I mean, I think talking about freedom in the right way will be helpful. I think that believing that our own personal quirks and commitments are part of freedom rather than something we should be ashamed of will be helpful. I think recognizing that you can build institutions in order to help us all be free is helpful, right? So, I mean, to be clear, it's not good for the Ukrainians that their cities were destroyed. It just creates an extreme situation from which we can draw lessons precisely for the everyday. And the lesson is that freedom is positive, that it's not about banging your head against the wall. Sometimes it's about building walls, right? I mean, the wall behind me holds up a roof, and that's a very nice thing. Houses are good things. Freedom is not about being against everything. Freedom is about creating things, and it's about using the limits around you and turning the limits around you into tools, so that you can improvise and innovate, and generate. So it's partly an attitude, and it's partly an attitude leading to building institutions. And I think it's also a matter of hope, right? I mean, if people in much worse situations than we are can be hopeful, then we can probably be also hopeful too. And of course, we're not going to do without ideals. Like, part of the notion that freedom is positive is that ideals are real. That's a basic part of this book. Ideals are real. So the books behind me are real, but the ideas inside those books are also real. Your body is physically real, but your ideas are also real. The concepts we're talking about are real. It's not just sound waves from my lungs and yours. The concepts are also real. And that's positive because it's something which is not about just the physical world holding us back. It's about how we create, how we cooperate, how we can do unpredictable things. So I think, I'm not just saying, you can't saying raw positive freedom isn't enough. But I think taking this very powerful concept of freedom and recognizing how affirming and constructive it can be is a good step forward.
Just with one more question before I do. I'm just curious how writing this book has changed you. It took 5 years of your life. You put yourself in harm's way to go report it. I mean, how are you a different person, if you are?
Well, I'm 5 years older. That's for sure. It's a great question, because I was kind of mocking books about freedom earlier by saying usually people write these things from the point of view that they're right, and memoirs similarly. I started. This is a big problem to solve. and I'm, you know, and maybe I didn't solve it, but it's the most important problem to solve, I think, because it's the concept which is right at the center of how we talk about life and politics. And I think philosophically, it really is the value of values, because if things are good, then the thing which allows us to realize those good things is at a different level. And that's how I see freedom. But yeah, the values that I hold don't give me direct access to a clear description of what freedom would be. And if you think that freedom is positive, then what you're thinking is that other people's values are real too. And if you think freedom involves facts, you have to recognize you don't know everything, including about yourself, which is a very critical point. In the negative freedom view, you kind of assume you know everything about yourself because the barrier is the only problem, right? The government's bad, but I'm fine, right? The government's bad. I'm fine. And that's not true. You're not fine. You don't know the things about yourself you need to know not to be manipulated and fooled. And in order to know those things, you have to listen to other people. And like, it's easy for me to say these things, but part of what I did in writing the book was to take experiences where clearly I had made mistakes involving basic American matters like health, like race, and where I tried to take those mistakes and make something of them, right? Which is kind of one of the principles here. Like your mistakes are not limitations. Your mistakes are things that you can turn into tools if you treat them the right way, and you would own up to them. And you own up to them. And so, but in order to operationalize this, I had to do some of the things that you're alluding to. Like, I thought the draft was pretty good, and then I took it to prison and taught it in prison for a semester with some really fabulous incarcerated students, and they pushed me, and they read my philosophers with me, and they saw things I didn't see, and they helped me break down my own version of what it means to be American, have the American dream, in ways I could not have done by myself. And likewise, Ukraine. I mean, I went to Ukraine to test myself, to listen to other people. So how am I a different person now? I mean, I've been humbled by trying to do this, and yet I'm glad that I remain glad that I tried it, right? It's a big challenge. And I'm glad that I took up the challenge. And I'm glad that, I wrote 225 drafts of this thing. And then had a wonderful editor who made the difference between 225 and 226 incredibly meaningful. And so one of the things that I did was I had to constantly correct myself and allow myself to be corrected, and recognize like where my own powers came to an end, and where I had to try to keep doing things differently. So like the book in a way is kind of it kind of represents what it's about. I had to listen to other people. I had to make mistakes. I had to find new ways of doing things in order to try to write a book like this. So, I mean, I hope that like now at the age of 55, I'm a little bit less predictable than I was at the age of 50 when I started this, and that I'm a bit more of a free person and a better listener. I think I'm a better listener now,
Yeah,
which is something.
it's interesting. You have the philosopher's mind. A plus B equals C. In a way, I can see that in some of the arguments as they unfold. But also, there's very much a spiritual aspect, or there's a journey in this book that's going on, and I could see that somehow there'd be a tension between those two impulses. To reconcile them. Yeah,
that's a great point. And you can't reconcile them in the sense of trying to bring them down to one thing,
right?
And that's a basic element of the book, like thinking morally and reasoning in a straight line from premise to premise are different kinds of thinking. They're different sorts of rationality, and they're both necessary. And whether or not we like it, they're both present in the world, and they're both real and helpful. And so this is a pluralist book. I don't think you can actually talk about freedom just by reasoning from premise to premise, because freedom is inherently about what we think is good. And the things that we think of as good don't fit together perfectly like pieces in a puzzle, or like links in a chain, or like links in a logical chain. They just don't. You can't say loyalty is better than honesty or something like that, or honesty is better than loyalty. It depends. It depends on the situation, and ultimately you're going to make a judgment yourself, and that judgment will then change you. You'll be a slightly different person than you were before because of the judgment you made about that. So that way of thinking it's just present. And so I wrote the book in different genres. Hopefully they all come together, but I wrote them in different genres because you need different kinds of thinking. You need the kind of thinking which says, wait a minute, 35 years later, I see the mistake. And you need the kind of thinking which says, I believe in this, and let me show you how it's wonderful. And you need the kind of thinking which gives you examples. And so on. You need different kinds of thinking to write about freedom. And so I was trying to exemplify that. And I enjoyed it. I had fun with it, although it was also incredibly difficult and required a lot of going back and revising and trying to get it to make sense.
Wow. I have a question here. Someone wants you to talk briefly just about the seminar you teach called Reading the Other
Okay.
at Borderland Foundation in Poland.
Well, that was also a test. So Reading the Other, and it has origins in the Borderland Foundation, which is a beautiful place in Sejny in Krasnogruda, Poland, where they do deep work in art, in theater, in painting, music, to try to allow people to understand other people's perspectives. And so it's akin to what I do, but it's different methods. And Reading the Other is a seminar which colleagues and I have run there for several years in a row now, which in some sense for me had its origins in a book of conversation that I did with my now deceased colleague, Tony Judd. But the idea was that we were going to read people, but we were going to read thinkers in confrontation with other thinkers. So not a thinker alone, but a thinker with thinkers that were helpful to that thinker, or who opposed that thinker, who were the context of the teachers or the students, or in some way related to that thinker, and read them together. And then do it together. So, in a circle with a few people leading, but a circle where we're all reading the same texts, and then we work them over for 5 hours. And this book was related to that in the sense that last year, people very kindly read my text along with some of the thinkers that were important for my text. And that was one more test of me. That was one more opportunity that I was fortunate to have to be able to listen to people.
Oh, interesting. Well, thank you so much for your time tonight. I don't know if people realize you're really a person of the Midwest from near Dayton, Ohio.
Yes.
I want to leave us with this final question. It's interesting. By my reckoning, your family moved to Ohio on a farm in about 1806. And
that's a pretty specific reckoning, my friend.
Yeah, you've spoken like a true professor. And you're born in 1969.
Mm-hmm.
The world, which also happens to be the birthplace of the internet. So you are as old as the internet. It's interesting.
But unlike the internet, I'm getting more interesting.
You are. You're not repeating yourself. The world, as you looked out your window in 1969 in Ohio, what did it offer you? And are you happy with of where you're going and kind of what's next for you?
That question, we could have done this whole conversation on that question, honestly, because the book, as you know well, it doesn't begin in 1969, but it begins in 1976 with the American Bicentennial, and with a moment where I'm ringing a bell. I'm 6 years old, about to be 7. I'm ringing a bell, and I'm thinking about the Liberty Bell, and I'm thinking back to the idea of something 200 years ago, and time is a cycle, and in some way it's all true, it's all helpful. There was a Liberty Bell, and in some way it wasn't true. The bell at the time in 1776, it wasn't called the Liberty Bell, and interestingly, it was named Liberty Bell later by abolitionists and by people in the women's suffrage movement. In other words, by people who were aspiring for America to be a better country. And so, I love that farm, and I love that bell, and it's still there. And I just saw it a few weeks ago. And one needs to love the things one loves, but one also needs to be able to correct the things that can be corrected. And that's part of the structure of the book, is what I've learned in the 5 decades or so since that moment about that country, and how the things that I think I understand now would make it possible for us to have a better future. And so what's cut into your question is, it's gone pretty well for me since that moment. I had really good public schools. I had a lot of institutions behind me. I had those farms behind me. I had an intact family behind me. I had a lot of good professors in my universities behind me. And maybe I had some talent, and maybe I worked, but there were a lot of things behind me, from 1806, if you like, forward, that were making my own American dream, my own little rebellions, my own little achievements possible. And yet I'm a liar and a fool if I'm not able to look around me and say, there are different American stories, and those past 50 years have gone differently for different people for reasons that we can understand, having to do with problems that go back, to 1806 or further, which have to do with built-in inequalities of race and inequalities that are growing ever greater, even right now, of wealth. And and I would be wrong not just not to notice those, but I would be wrong not to try to think about how the American concept of freedom could be improved, made better, because that's built into the whole notion of freedom. The people who talked about freedom in 1776, they had some things wrong, but they knew they had some things wrong, and they knew that the whole spirit of the project was going to be a self-correcting one. And so I think being faithful to those people doesn't mean repeating them mindlessly or deifying them. I think it means rethinking freedom, making it bigger, making it more inviting, making it more functional so that it can spread out and provide a basis, moral and institutional, so that more people, ideally everybody, can have that America where things get better for them, right? So it's a story. I mean, things do go well for me in general, but because they've gone well for me, I've got a certain responsibility to understand why America doesn't go well for everybody, and I feel like I have a certain responsibility also to think about an idea which would be true, but also which would be accessible and which would make that America more like that thing which we wish that it would become. Which is why the book ends in 2076. We've been talking about freedom, but which is the beginning of the book. And then there are some ideas along the way in the middle some of which you mentioned, and I mentioned too, the sovereignty, the unpredictability, the mobility, factuality, solidarity. But at the end, there's an idea of government, and and at the very, very end, there's a notion of, well, if we got all this right, what would things be like in 2076?
Well, thank you. I'm curious myself, and I can't thank you enough for sharing tonight these thoughts. It has impact on me, and I know everyone watching. And I want to read the next book you write. So good luck and congratulations.
Thank you. Thanks for preparing, and I really enjoyed this conversation too. Thanks to everybody who's here.
Yeah. Good night.
Good night.
Shelby Van Pelt, featuring remarkably bright creatures. Get tickets at nationalwritersseries.org.